What I want to get into tonight is the question of how the church should adapt to the internet age. And in particular, the church has really been known for its focus on the local church context. It's been known for getting involved actively in our current community, where we're here, where we're living, in your neighborhoods, in your town. You go to church, and that church seeks to implement itself in that community and to better it and to support the families in that neighborhood, in that city. Now, we're in an internet age now, and a few things have caused me to start thinking more actively about this. The first thing that has got me questioning this a little bit, guys, is the pandemic. With the pandemic, a lot of churches had to shutter their doors. And when they did so, some went online and some did not. And as a result, many churches have not survived, although some are. And some churches stayed open. It's a whole mess politically. I'm not trying to dive into that. But the question of the pandemic really brought to the forefront the question of, can church be done online in any sort of appreciable, real way? So that was a big question. Now, the other thing is parachurch organizations have existed for a very long time. And so parachurch organizations have been functioning in this way. And sometimes they're tied to a church, sometimes not. How legitimate is that? These are questions I wanted to ask. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because this is kind of assumed in some contexts. Our approach to this, how we understand this, is kind of assumed sometimes. And here I just want to play for you an intro to a sermon done by Jeff Durbin from Apologia Church. And the reason I'm playing this for you is I remember watching their sermons regularly, and this is standard fare at the beginning of their sermons, at least before they started streaming them online. So listen to what Jeff Durbin has to say, and this is just standard party line stuff. This is what we need to communicate to people if we are a church posting our content online. Listen to what he has to say.
Hey everybody, I'm Pastor Jeff Durbin with Apologia Church. I want to thank you all so much for watching the content right here on Apologia Studios channel. What you're about to watch is a sermon, a message from Apologia Church's worship service. And again, I want to thank you all so much for watching, for liking, for commenting, for sharing the sermon itself. We truly believe that it's important for the Christian church to have an engagement in the public square with the Word of God. So we thank you so much for partnering with us to send this out across the world. I just wanted to say something before you actually watch this, and that is that I'm not your pastor. Though I'd love to be, I am not your pastor. And it's very important that as you're watching this, you know that it's God's design for individual Christians to be part of a local Christian church under the care of qualified, faithful, biblical elders. And so as much as we love all of you watching these sermons, and we're thankful to God that God uses them to bless you, to encourage you, I do want to encourage you as a minister of the gospel to get plugged into a local body of believers, particularly, I think, important, a Reformed church would be best. But we want to encourage you to get plugged into a solid biblical church where you can fellowship, where you can worship, where you can serve, where you can be connected. That is vitally important and actually a biblical command. And so as much as, again, as we love for your participation, your partnership, and we are so thankful to God that He's using these in your lives, we want to encourage you to get plugged into a local church. You can, though.
And you can see Vector says Matt Chandler does the exact same thing at the start of his online services, if they post a sermon or something like that, okay? And this is standard fare. Now, here's where I want to go with this, is I have often said the exact same thing. I've often, maybe not, before our church services, but when people have come into the channel and said, how do I grow more with God? How do I learn, etc.? Local church, local church, local church. Okay? This is standard evangelical fare, especially if you believe strongly in the Word of God and you're focused on sola scriptura, etc. This is just standard evangelical fare. And I want you to know that I kept repeating it because I saw other people in my context also repeating it. I heard Jeff Durbin saying it. I've heard Matt Chandler say it, etc. And so I would always tell people local church, local church, local church. Now, he says this is biblical. And so I think the passage he's probably referring to is Hebrews 10:25. Let's take a look. Not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. Okay? So there you go. It couldn't be more clear. We should not neglect to meet together, as is the habit of some. So here's my problem with utilizing Hebrews 10:25 in this way. It doesn't specify how we are meant to gather together. It doesn't specify how we're meant to meet together. And the fact of the matter is the biblical authors could not have conceived of us meeting together in the ways we do today. For example, many of you guys are regulars here in the channel. We meet together regularly, multiple times a week. Some of you I have more weekly interaction with than some members in my congregation. Wow, that's a shock. Is that appropriate? Is that okay? I don't know, but it's something we need to think about. Now, you might say, well, they could only have met in person because that's what it was at the time, so that's obviously what they meant. Sure, I understand what you're saying, but are they saying this because it's meant to be normative for us, or merely because they couldn't conceive of meeting in any other way, shape, or form? I don't really know about that piece. So it's a question I started to ask. Like I said, the pandemic made me start to think about this a lot more as well, because a lot of people started doing church from home, and parachurch organizations have been functioning this way for a long time, for a very, very long time. Sometimes they're tethered and tied to a church, particularly if they're of the persuasion of Jeff Durbin and others, but many times they're not, okay? So I just kind of had this swimming around in my mind. I'm not criticizing any of it right now. As you guys know, I am the pastor of a local church. I'm not abandoning the local church. I'm continuing to promote the necessity of the local church, but I started asking these questions. And then as I was asking these questions, Paul Vanderklay put out a video today called The Internet Disruption of the Church. And I actually want to walk through this video and engage with what he says here because I think it's very, very relevant to the discussion. And so let's walk through, and what he's doing is he's trying to wrestle not with the, how do I put it, doctrinal purity of local church. That's what I was just discussing now. But he's wrestling with the pragmatics of the local church. He's wrestling with how does the local church fare when stacked up against an internet age. That's what he's wrestling with. And so I had this concept on the one hand, and on the other hand, I started engaging with Vanderklay on this, and it really has started to make me think about this topic. And it's very relevant to what we do, because we meet here in a religious type of context regularly, weekly. I pray with you guys. I try to give counsel. We do Bible studies together. I do my sermon preparation. You guys watch me preach. I mean, a lot of that looks kind of like what we're trying to accomplish in church. So how does that relate? Hopefully, Vanderklay can help us to be a guide here. I want to walk through some of what he talks about when it comes to this stuff. Now, he's engaging with a podcast from Tim Ferriss, and Tim Ferriss had somebody on his podcast named Balaji Srinivasan, okay? And I'm sure I butchered that. But there's a very interesting discussion here about internet culture and the question of, can institutions that predated the internet, can they even survive what is coming and what is already here? So let's go ahead and listen to Vanderklay as he kind of interacts with this podcast.
Okay, what's my point? Point is, as faith in the I don't think many institutions that predated the internet will survive the internet.
That's a big statement.
Did you hear that? I don't think many institutions that predated the internet will survive the internet. Like Paul says, rightfully so, that is a big statement, okay? Is it going to stand? Let's see how Paul interacts with this.
But I think about that with respect to the Roman Catholic Church, because the Roman Catholic Church survived the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation hit in certain places in Europe very unevenly. It hit the Holy Roman Empire, it hit the Netherlands, it hit Switzerland, it hit England, it hit Hungary. It hit some of these places, and from those places, it spread out throughout the rest of the world. Obviously, in North America, in the United States, became, a deeply Protestant nation. Roman Catholicism really started to impact at the middle of the 19th century. But what the Protestant Reformation did was force the Roman Catholic Church to basically address it in a number of ways. And there's a lot of elements to the Counter-Reformation. It's interesting how, robust religious traditions are. And it's, his comment there, I think, is profound. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that was very, very insightful. I never would have compared what we have going on right now to what the Roman Catholic Church was experiencing during the Protestant Reformation, but I think the comparison is apt. I think it makes sense. And what did he say? He said, what happened when the Protestant Reformation came is it forced the Roman Catholic Church to deal with it. The Roman Catholic Church had to answer and address the fact of the Protestant Reformation somehow. And of course, those who are aware of history understand that there was a profound counter-reformation that came. And there was a great purifying of the Roman Catholic Church in many ways during that time. They were challenged in some profound ways. They changed and adjusted, and in some ways they didn't change, and they dug their heels in, okay? But they had to address it somehow. And so I think, following the train of thought of Vanderklay here, is that we as Christians need something like an internet counter-reformation. We as Christians need to recognize the internet has come, and we need to do something as the church, Protestants, Catholics, whatever, to pose a counter-reformation type answer to the fact that the internet is changing things. The internet is affecting how we are going about doing church, how we're going about religious conversation, how we're going about conversion, evangelism, etc. To ignore the internet is to ignore it at our peril because it merely pushes us into obscurity. We will no longer have anything to say. We will no longer have anything relevant in the marketplace of ideas because we refuse to engage that marketplace on its terms. Instead, if we demand that everybody revert back to our mentality, we're not pushing an appropriate counter-reformation, and as such, we won't have a voice. And so the church needs to address this somehow. The church needs to address the fact that the internet is here. Now, how are we going to address it? Can we take church online? Is there a way we can do a both and? I don't know, but we're going to have to discuss this and recognize the church needs to have an internet presence in some way, shape, or form. Okay, very important idea. Okay, so Paul Vanderklay is raising some very good questions. Let's go to this next idea, and I'm only going to play a piece because there's a background to this. I'm only going to play about 30 seconds. There's a background to this I want to explain to you guys that's relevant to his comments here.
Yeah, at the same time, one of the comments I made with respect to platforms, the kind of disruption that the internet does and technology in general doesn't seem to always displace older things, but rather relocates them. For example, horses are still around. Horses are a fine hobby. Like I said, I have a cousin whose wife is now a farrier. She does horseshoes that's her job. She was working in an office. She likes this a lot better. It's a physically demanding job, but she enjoys it. And
you might be sitting there going, what do horses have to do with what we're talking about here? There's some background to what Vanderklay is referring to. Okay, Vanderklay has talked about in the past that horses used to be a mode or means of transportation. Before the vehicle, before carriages and things like that, we rode horses to places. New technology comes along, horses are no longer needed. Does that mean that horses disappear? No, horses have not disappeared, but rather than being completely pushed out, they have been relocated. Now horses are not transportation, they're a hobby. What does this have to do with the church? Well, we have a new mode through which people are engaging, okay? That mode is the internet. We have a new medium through which people are forming their relationships, people are formulating their groups. This is through the internet. Now, what happened to the horse might happen to the church, okay? The horse didn't get completely obliviated. It's not like they were extinct after that. They just stopped serving the role or function of transportation. They moved into a different role. And so here's a question we have to ask ourselves, okay? How do Christians need to be prepared for their new cultural role? Okay, we may have a new cultural role that we are taking place in as a church. Remember, churches used to be places where people gathered, they assimilated, that's where you met people, that's where you discussed, that's what you learned. Now people have apps for that, right? People don't go to church to meet people anymore. People don't go to church to, congregate and have that, interaction with each other. Maybe some do, but it's becoming outmoded, okay? So a new question arises. What is the church's new cultural role? How are they going to adapt to it? Or can we preserve their current cultural role by making some adjustments? These are the sorts of questions we need to be asking, okay? Otherwise, we're going to find ourselves without a place in the culture or society at large, and therefore without a voice. And I think that can only be harmful to the gospel. So how can we implement these things in a way that is practical and actually adjust for the society we currently live in? Okay? Again, I am not advocating for let's just wipe the local church out altogether. I'm not, okay? But perhaps we are going into an age or an era where the local church serves a different function than it has traditionally served. And we might have to embrace that, all right? So just some thoughts that he's throwing out there, and I think it's really, really helpful to engage with these ideas. Something is lost when you go online versus in person. There is something lost there, and we recognize that. But what is it we're losing, and can those things we're losing be made up for in other ways? I don't know. But these are the questions we need to ask as we enter an internet age. I don't think we can afford to ignore this. Okay? And functionally, that's what I see a lot of theologically conservative evangelical churches doing right now. If you're a good Christian, you'll go to the local church. That's what it's all about. Theology and doctrine says so. As we heard earlier, Hebrews chapter 10, right? But people don't function that way. Not your regular average Joe, at least. The vast majority of people that are going to church are trying to find something that works functionally for them. So you're narrowing down so much that church is now becoming just for the purist. Now, I would love to convert all of your nominal attendees into purists, but it's not realistic. Many people treat the church in a functional way. They go when it's convenient for them, and they don't go when it's not convenient for them. So are we going to have to adjust or do something different? I don't know. And again, I don't think we can just afford to say, this is a doctrinal matter. You just don't believe the Bible if you're not going to a local church. I don't think we can afford to do that. Now, what adjustments we have to make remains to be seen. But this is part of why I'm bringing the conversation up. I think it's relevant. I think we need to have a discussion about it. And I think we need to learn from the situation that we're in to grow into what the church needs to be doing in online spaces. So I think that's a very, very important topic. Let's go back to Vanderklay and see what he says going forward.
And this is part of the reason why I made the quip on Twitter about Beth Moore. Beth Moore inspiring women to keep horses. Beth Moore, as imagine her sort of the founder of Uber, inspires women to keep horses. In other words, women to lead churches. And in some ways, our churches like horse stables as compared to Beth Moore, who first via Bible studies, colonizes and infiltrates churches, infiltrates and penetrates social networks. Before there were social networks, churches, in many ways, one of the ways, if you want to influence churches, is through, this is basically how John Calvin did it. Calvin's Institutes became enormously popular, an enormously popular book, and via the printing press and John Calvin's Institutes, he influenced generations of Protestants in Europe, and of course he had Geneva, and some of his ideas take root through John Knox in Scotland and through the Puritans over to America. And, those are powerful things as opposed to what was, happening officially in places. And it's in that way that the leadership of institutions lose control because these ideas just go out through these other platforms and take over.
Now, there was a lot there, and I'm going to try to summarize a lot of what he was talking about. He brings up Beth Moore. Why? What he said many times in some of his other videos is that Beth Moore has more influence over Christianity and Christian circles than the vast majority of local churches and local pastors do. Period. Right. Why? Because she has adapted to and leveraged the internet. She started utilizing these Bible studies. They got out there. They infiltrated from within. They sprang up from within. And now Beth Moore has more influence over Christianity and church culture than the local pastors and the churches themselves do. This is how, he said, John Calvin did this. John Calvin wrote the Institutes of the Christian Religion. They became very, very popular. Everybody was reading them. And then that sort of theology began to permeate its way through the churches at the time. And that obviously was a huge boon to the Protestant Reformation. Why was the Institutes of Christian Religion able to promulgate itself so much? Because of the printing press. What do we have in the internet? A different printing press. We have a different way for the common person to get their information out there and to become enormously influential in Christian circles, even if they don't have a formal church platform, even if they're not formally running a church. And what he's pointing out with Beth Moore here is there's all this controversy about whether or not women can be pastors in the Southern Baptist Church and, egalitarianism versus complementarianism. And one of the things Paul has said is that it's almost besides the point. Why? Beth Moore doesn't have anything to gain from being a pastor of a local church. She already has all the influence, clout that she could ever want or need. Notice that this is what happens when the church just sticks to what it's saying and doesn't actually adjust or adapt to what the culture is doing. Doesn't put out anything else when it comes to the internet space. And this is why we are struggling with this situation that we have right now and wrestling back and forth within denominations about this. For example, we've been theologically gatekeeping Beth Moore to keep her out, but really, there's nothing worth gatekeeping anymore. You can see, okay, we've got the gates kept, we've got guards standing there, but the city inside has already been ravaged. It's tattered because all of the people who were being influenced inside the gates have moved on. They've moved on to different areas. They've moved on to different villages, towns, etc. And what are those villages and towns? These are the online spaces where they're being actively influenced from other Christians. These are those online spaces where Christian influencers are really making an impact, and the church at large doesn't have the influence that it once did. In some ways, to me at least, it looks like Beth Moore is doing the church's job better than the church itself is doing it. And that's why people have migrated to listening to her rather than the local church. This is, of course, not across the board, but as a matter of speaking generally, we can see this trajectory happening. And these are what the things that the church has to engage with and deal with because these online spaces are becoming so influential and so powerful. Have we lost control of what's going on? Have we ceded the territory entirely to internet influencers? Big Christian names online? Perhaps. Again, it's something we in the local church are going to need to think about. All right. Now, he begins to shift a little bit and start talking about how can the church engage in culture itself. And so he talks about James K.A. Smith a little bit, who wrote a book called You Are What You Love. Okay, this is a very important idea. Let's hear what Vanderklay has to say, and then I'm going to describe a little bit of what's going on here because some of you may not have this background.
It is this universal asset. And the reason is because it connects people peer to peer. And so what that does is one of my laws of internet physics is the internet increases variance. Okay. Why?
Think about that. Laws of internet physics. Because a lot of times, this guy talks so fast and he's throwing so many ideas out there. And these ideas he's been living with and they're familiar to him. But you have to kind of slow him down and say, the internet increases variance. What do you mean by variance? Diversity. So part of what happens in confessional churches is that, and again, this is a product of the Protestant Reformation. Confessionalism was a way to manage diversity, and nation states were going to have a unified confession that was going to define them as nation states. That continued to break down, and another step in the breaking down of that was religious toleration, where now the federal government of the United States, well, early on, different states had their own state churches, but states gave them up. There would be religious toleration. But then you begin to ask, well, you have these religious confessions. What are the commonalities between them that are actually, in some ways, being the non-confessional implicit religions that are affording the cooperation of the state to function. And so actually a lot of what I do on my YouTube channel is I'm always trying to discern, and we've been talking about this for a generation in church planting land, trying to exegete the culture, because there are religious confessions beneath the surface. And Jamie Smith has written about this in a lot of his work with his cultural liturgies, that there are cultural liturgies, there are religious liturgies beneath the surface that are propagating themselves. And now what the internet does is increase variance.
Very important ideas here. What's being discussed? What's being talked about? Well, first, note that they talked in the podcast about peer-to-peer. No longer do we have the middleman. They're going to talk about that in the future, but now interaction is peer-to-peer. You can go directly to the individual and have active interaction with them. So that's an important aspect, right? Then he talks about this idea, James K.A. Smith, cultural liturgies. What does he mean? Everybody has a set of beliefs or ideas, and online variance is increased. What do they mean? Now you have accessibility to all of those cultural ideas. I started going to InterVarsity Christian Fellowship when I was in college, and they told me how much of a problem they had with the Hare Krishnas that had infiltrated their fellowship. I'm going to be honest, I didn't know anything about Hare Krishna as a religious movement. Who here has interacted with anybody who's Hare Krishna? Some of you may have, some of you may have not. What about Mormonism? What about Jehovah's Witness? Baptists, Presbyterians, right? Have you interacted with a Muslim in person? Right? Have you talked to Hindus in person? What are they talking about? The internet increases variance. What that means is now everybody has access to everything. Everybody is constantly engaging with one another on a peer-to-peer basis. It used to be that you never had to worry about the Hare Krishnas infiltrating your local church. Why? Because they weren't in town. They didn't exist anymore. Now, one of your congregants can go listen online, and immediately after hearing your sermon, they can pick up some other ideas from some other influencers. It's a very important concept, right? The fact that we now have access to one another peer-to-peer, all of this variance is increased. And again, what Paul brings up is the cultural liturgies that is talked about by James K.A. Smith. All of us have these underlying belief systems that we act out in the public sphere. And this is why people's mindsets are so often influenced for one thing or another. This is where LGBT issues and a bunch of other stuff has come up, because we have cultural liturgies that we're all acting out in the cultural sphere, in the cultural space, and they're affecting our minds, our hearts, our beliefs, etc. So that's an important aspect that we need to recognize. The internet, even if we ignore it entirely as the church, is going to affect us because this variance has increased so much. We need to be ready for it. We need to react to it. Not only that, I saw a comment here that I thought was very, very interesting. This is from Zimmy. I think this is relevant. Zimmy says, I usually don't like church too often. I like gospel music, hymns, lots of hallelujah. Honestly, too many preachers are just mind-numbingly boring. Each Sunday feels like seeing the same movie over and over. Online, I can pick the preacher and the church. I think this is very important, Zimmy, and this is just a function of our technology and culture and society today. Because all of us have access to experts across the spectrum, we are no longer as embracing of the local that we have. I'll give an example, right? It used to be that for music in church, anybody who could play an instrument played, and everybody was happy to have them play. But now I can just listen to professional grade music anytime I want and have a worship experience in that. But once you have access, guys, to experts across the board, no longer do I have to put up with amateurs. No longer do I have to put up with people who are less skilled, because I have access to the greatest skill across the world at any moment in the form of the internet. Again, it affects us. It affects us. And I'm not being critical at all here, because I get it. I don't want to listen to a bad preacher. It's a waste of my time, right? I'd rather listen to a good preacher. I'd rather listen to a good sermon. But the internet age has caused it to where if your local talent isn't skilled or doesn't have expertise in their particular field, it's so easy to just move on. I'll just go home and listen to John Piper instead. Very, very easy for that to happen. Angie made a remark that I thought was really good here. Angie says, your current model that you have organically fell into seems like the future. Have a local church and satellite out from there with online teaching, fellowship, and praise. There is a place for all at once. I really like this idea, Angie, and perhaps this is the way of the future. I don't know. And like you said, we fell into it. We didn't do it by design. I will say that my online interaction that we've been doing on here, streaming the services, me streaming off to the side and having conversations with you guys, has been immensely beneficial for my local congregation. I am engaging with topics and ideas that I never would have engaged with had I not been meeting with you guys regularly and discussing these things. I am more aware of certain issues and concepts than I would be if I was just engaging with my local congregation. And also, my local congregation has in many ways started to interact with you guys here online. So I can see the benefit of what you're talking about, Angie. And that might be the way of the future. I don't know. But again, this internet space is a space that churches need to engage in. Otherwise, they're going to find themselves dead. That's what I think. So again, that's why we're having these conversations. Now he's going to talk about this variance idea, guys. The sense in which we have access to points of views and concepts that we never had access to before, okay? And how that affects the church on a fundamental level.
And this is why, so on, let's say, a place like an estuary, like the Bridges of Meaning Discord server, there's enormous variance in the Bridges of Meaning Discord server. How can we have productive conversations despite the enormous confessional variance? In some ways, that's been a part of my life's work. It's
Great
been
question.
A part of what's at the heart of this channel. I mentioned in the question and answer today, I had recently did an interview with a young man who's in an evangelical seminary, and someone made the comment, we need more evangelicals. You should talk to more evangelicals. And part of me thought, I kind of talk to who comes forward. I'm not really picking. But another part of me thought, I like talking to a lot of different people, because I think one of the key skills we're going to need to develop is this capacity to talk across confessional lines, not only confessional lines within Christendom, but religious confessionality beneath the surface. And this.
Okay, very important concept, guys. One of the important skills we need to develop, says Paul, is the ability to talk across confessional lines. I think that is huge. I've talked about this before, right? How often have I mentioned the fact that we need to be able to have conversations? I've talked about having conversations with heretics, etc. In a space where there is more variance, where there is more ideas and opinions being expressed, we need to be more open and able to have conversations and discussions. We no longer can engage in the Protestant Reformation practice of let's burn the heretics at the stake. And yet so often we see religion being implemented that way in these online spaces. Without saying it in the same words as him, this is what I'm constantly emphasizing when I keep saying that we need to have open discussion, open conversation, etc. I cut him off a little bit. Let's let him finish his thought here.
I think is part and parcel about what Balaji Srinivasan is talking about in the internet age, because variance has now increased enormously. And so actually what we're doing as
So there you go. Variance has increased enormously, and as it has, we need to be able to have open lines of conversation and discussion. I think that a mere Christianity approach, at least pragmatically being implemented, is more important now than ever before. Being able to recognize that this is fundamentally what we recognize as Christian, and we're very open on the secondary and tertiary matters of the faith, because internet proliferation has caused us to all be in interaction with one another. We're all discussing with each other all the time. And the chances of you stumbling across a heretic online are so high that we need to know how to engage in healthy dialogue across confessional boundaries and confessional lines. And this is true not only of other Christians, but it's also true of other belief systems at large. Again, he's going back to cultural liturgies. You're going to interact with people on the internet who have completely different cultural liturgies than you, and you need to, because of increased variance on the internet, be able to interact with them in a healthy dialogue sort of way. It's very important in our day and age. And I think I just had a gut feeling about this before when we started streaming and interacting. And I was always a little bit hesitant to condemn heretics and to name names and all this type of stuff. But he put it the perfect way that I think we need to think about it. Again, this is a skill we're going to have to develop as the church, guys. Otherwise, we are not going to find ourselves engaging well in an internet age, okay? We must develop the skill of discussing with those who believe differently than us, having open conversation, having dialogue. We must get good at this, church. If we don't get good at this, we are going to fall flat on our faces in the internet age, okay? So very important idea here. All right, now he starts talking about this idea of the church itself and the pastors of the church becoming functionally useless, okay, in our current society and culture. So I want to play this for you. I will make my comments.
First, let me give the observation, right? The observation is you go from 30-minute sitcoms to 30-episode Netflix binges or 30-second YouTube clips. You go from, a stable 9-to-5 job to a 20-something billionaire or a 40-year-old failed son who's made nothing of themselves. You go from...
For context, he's talking about variance again, how different things are in the online space.
A taxi ride, standard taxi ride, to Uber, which actually has very long trips and also very short ones. Like the whole thing is spread out relative to the ride time of a normal taxi. And the reason for this, this is a very common thing in every area. I've seen hundreds, probably thousands of companies at this point. I've seen all these graphs, right? So you'll have to believe me that this is a synthesis of a lot of different graphs that I've seen. When the internet disruptor comes in, variance increases. There's more downside and more upside, more amazing outcomes and more really bad outcomes in all kinds of ways.
And I think this is exactly what we're seeing in terms of religious confessionalities. If the Protestant Reformation sort of became this massive fracturing of the church, well, in some ways it looks like the internet is a massive crushing of confessionality as a means of having church. That's a terrifying thing because that's a massive dislocation. And it's it's something this is a big deal.
Does that happen? Because it connects people peer-to-peer, entities peer-to-peer, it removes the middleman. It removes the mediator.
And in many cases, the middleman in religious organizations in the United States is the pastor. It's
There you go, guys. So you can see the middleman is removed, right? Because of the internet. And our role is being displaced as the church. And again, if we're going to remove the middleman, what does Paul say? That's the pastor. But I think it even goes further than that, guys. I don't think just the pastor is being removed from his place of influence, his place of discussion. I think not only is the pastor being removed, but the church as an institution is also being made irrelevant. Why is all of this happening? Because of what he said. Peer-to-peer can happen now. Now for your spiritual formation, for your spiritual growth, in order to be discipled, etc., you don't feel like you need to go to a local pastor. Instead, you can binge YouTube videos, talk to your friends and peers in Discord, have them link you ideas, and you can be engaging on all of these platforms, all independent of a local church. The pastor is no longer needed, and soon we're going to see the institutional church is no longer needed either. Or it's going to be segregated to this quaint idea like horses. That for the purists, for those who want to engage in it, it's there and available. But for everybody else, nobody is willing to go back to that old craftsman mindset. Instead, people are going to revert to what they can functionally get, easy, accessible, and allows them to consume it in the manner that is most convenient for them. That's the direction we're seeing things flow. And so if everything is moving to this direction with the peer-to-peer interaction and people outsourcing so much of what they used to get out of church to places online, into online communities, what can the church do to bridge the gap? What can we do to build a dam against the tide? We need to make some sort of adjustment. We can't just ignore it. And our church is being affected actively by this. So how can we do something to impact the community, to impact the world really where it's at? It's on the internet. Now, again, don't get me wrong. I don't think we can outsource everything that the church is. I think in-person meeting will always hold something special to it. But we have to recognize that the world is going a certain direction, and we as the church need to think actively about how we can bring the gospel to that space. I don't think the answer is, yeah, let them have their internets. We're gonna stick put in our buildings, and for those who are truly faithful, they'll come to the... Yeah, that's how you aren't evangelistic anymore. That's how you end up being the frozen chosen. That's how you end up being a bomb shelter Christian who is holed up in the church praying that Jesus would come back and save you from the culture and society. Not because the culture and society is so fallen, but because the culture and society went the way of the internet and you decided you didn't have to do anything about it. That's the question I want us to ask. Those are the answers I'm trying to see. The last little section here, he has a good discussion, again, kind of wrapping up the idea as he's engaging with his own forays into the internet, because he's a local pastor. This is what I love about Paul. Paul's a local pastor of a small church, similar to me, right? He's just got a lot more wisdom and experience than I do. Okay, but he's a pastor of a local church in Sacramento, and he's engaging in this online space, trying to figure out while we're going what we're doing. Let's hear what he has to say as he's wrestling with this whole church in the online space. I'm a local pastor. I'm an online Christian. What's he doing here?
Out of the internet, boom, it's a network state. And
again, what interests me is to what degree have I started unwittingly an ecclesiastical network state? You know, many have noted that, well, Pastor Paul, I hear more hours of your content than I listen to my local church pastor. And I don't want to completely just push aside the importance of locality. And I mean, right from the start, this, whatever it is we have going here, has valued in real lifeness.
I like that phrase.
But it's kind of going in a both and direction. You know, again, this part of the podcast just really got me thinking.
And
okay, so he doesn't want to deny the in real lifeness that is important, right? He is not minimizing the importance of locality, being present in a real life situation with others, the local context, the local congregation. He doesn't want to minimize any of that, but he sees that many people are telling him, Paul, you're much more influential on me than my local pastor is. Well, there's something to that, okay? And how can we hold these things in tension at the same time? How can we promote the important aspects of real life integration with the fact that online people can search out and find exactly what they need, exactly what they're looking for at the drop of a hat? It's a very important question. He continues on here.
Graph of how people meet their partners.
I have not.
Okay, this is an amazing graph of like how people meet their significant other. The 2020 update. Basically, each little curve here tells a story, but it's like, did you meet at church? Did you meet through your parents? Did you meet at college? Did you meet at work? And you can see like meet at work is like this boomlet that kind of drops off. It's peaked in the 80s and it drops off in the 90s with, you know, various kinds of pathologization of something like that, right? So what dominates everything today is internet, and in particular, basically, where norms have shifted now is that it's actually more legitimate. I mean, like, I've aged out of this, fortunately, right? But for my younger, friends or what have you, it is impolite to hit on, often considered, depending on the situation, it's often considered impolite to hit on somebody in real life, but it's totally okay to do so on Tinder. So of course humans are contextual, and of course the same behavior that's okay in a bar is not okay in a workplace or what have you. But now that's actually extended to digital venues as well. So Tinder alone is just this massive revolution. And then you have like 20 of them happening at the same time. And so all of those are these things where the institutions that we have are simply not built for this at all. And that's why they're straining and stressing against it, and they're going to give, and we have to have a vision for what's on the other side.
So you're more a student of destabilization or stabilization, but it just so happens that right now these multiple revolutions combine to present destabilizing forces, not so much that you view humans or the future of humans through a dystopian or pessimistic lens. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. I think there's actually a lot of good stuff that's going to come out of this. I think we are.
One of the questions will be, is this acceleration we're seeing a temporary thing, or is it part of a curve? And so there's a lot of questions there. But that section, again, got me thinking about, well, what do I see happening around me? Because I'm using these tools. I'm using a YouTube channel. I'm using a podcast. I'm using a Discord server. I'm using Twitter. What does the church look like? What is a church? I don't know. But stuff is happening, and it's going somewhere. So, yeah. So, again, thanks to my colleague who pointed this out. Listen to the whole thing. Let me know what you think in the comments.
Boom. There you go, guys. I love those final questions. What is a church? What does it look like? I don't know. In this internet age, things have changed. Things have changed, and we need to adjust. Kind of final thoughts on this. People are living online now. That's where they're at, right? Things that we used to do in person, we no longer do in person. Many things that we used to do in person, we now do online almost exclusively. Now, again, I don't think we'll ever escape the local instantiation-ness that is necessary. But we have to recognize that much of what society has adapted and adjusted to, the church isn't. We've planted our flag in the sand and say, we're doing it the old way. And if you want to be a Christian, you'll do it the old way too. I think we can afford to draw lines in the sand on certain things, but we shouldn't draw lines in the sand across the board on this. Okay? I love the both and mentality that he talks about. He talks about this idea that right now it seems to be both and for me. I'm pastoring a local church. I've got my local congregation. I'm pouring into them. And I'm doing this online thing, and it's wildly successful, and there's a lot of interest, and people want to hear what we have to say. And so for now, I'm doing the both and. That's what Angie said earlier, right? Angie said you kind of stumbled into this situation where you're doing a both and. You have a local church, and then you're satelliting out with online teaching, fellowship, praise, etc. And so there's a bit of a both and going on here. And I think we need to kind of embrace that. It's tough because it's gray, right? It's not like there's delineated sharp lines everywhere that are very easy to manipulate and deal with. But we're going to have to figure out how to play in the gray. Otherwise, I think we're going to find ourselves outmoded. Now, I saw some discussion here about the separation between evangelism and discipleship. I think that is an unbiblical separation. We're not called to evangelize anyone. We're called to make disciples. The problem is that different people are on different stages of their discipleship journey. Some people aren't disciples yet. They need to be made disciples. Some people are baby disciples. They need to be made into mature disciples. And some people are mature disciples, and they need to be pushed to be even more mature disciples or to disciple others. So this sharp distinction that somehow says, we'll do outreach, we'll do evangelism online, but the moment you get saved, we got to shuffle you into a local church because now discipleship is happening. And when we do discipleship, it must be done in person, I think is an arbitrary distinction that isn't biblical and isn't efficient or expedient, okay? The fact of the matter is that all of us are at different locations on our discipleship journeys. Some haven't started yet. Some have started and are brand new. Some have started and been going for a while. And some are very mature, okay? And we all interact with getting some discipleship, getting some personal growth, online, in person, etc. Again, I am not denying that there are some advantages, some significant advantages, perhaps some insurmountable advantages to doing church in person, to being discipled in person, okay? There are some significant advantages to that. But I also recognize there are some things that we have traditionally done in person in the church that don't, of necessity, need to be done in person in the church, okay? Not all of it, at least. And so I think some both and could really do us some good here. Don't get me wrong. Personally, given the choice, I will always choose to meet in person, in the flesh. You can see people's facial expressions. You can interact with them in a special and unique way. You can feel their presence, their energy when you pray with them, right? There's an aspect of physical touch that is important, okay? We are instantiated human beings, but the fact of the matter is the internet opens up a whole Pandora's box of problems as it relates to traditional traditional organizations such as the church, and we need to figure out how to adapt to this new medium in an effective way. I think both and is looking similar to what we're going to need to be doing in the future, but I don't know for sure. I want to make a few remarks on just some ideas I thought of while considering this, okay? First, the question, well, somebody might say, you can't follow the commands of the New Testament without a local church, right? You can't follow the commands of the New Testament without a local church. Again, I would just ask the question, is that because it's true of necessity or because the biblical authors couldn't have think of things in any other way, right? Give an example of fellowship, okay? Fellowship. Don't get me wrong. I'm Baptist. There's something about a nice potluck, hanging out, chatting over a meal. It's fantastic. But I have also done plenty of Zoom calls with people I've never met, and there was a degree of fellowship in those Zoom calls. There was a degree of relating to one another, helping one another, supporting one another in that situation as well, okay? And that interrelatedness was helpful. Could it be called full-on fellowship? I don't know. There was something lesser about it, but it was fellowship nonetheless, okay? How much of that is, no, this just doesn't count. It doesn't count because the New Testament authors didn't write about it that way. Well, again, is it because that's true of necessity? It must be in person physically with the other human being, or is it because they couldn't conceive of the internet, okay? That's an important idea. Somebody might say this, well, if the only way you're interacting with somebody online is through the internet, right? If the only way you're interacting with somebody, let's say you're a pastor and somebody is reaching out to you to get some counsel or some discipleship. Well, if the only way you're interacting with them is through the internet, then you can't watch over their soul properly or appropriately. But I have a question about this. How is this different than the nominal attendee? I have a bunch of people who show up to my church every Sunday, watch the sermon. I get a quick hi-bye on the way out the door. And other than that, I get no interaction with them throughout the week. And I think this is true for the vast majority of churches across the nation, okay? There are people who attend regularly who you don't know anything about them. You don't know anything about their personal life. You don't know nothing because they show up, listen to the sermon, go home. And that happens repeatedly, okay? Now, I think that my interaction with some of those people is even less than some of my interaction with some of the people who show up here and chat. Some of you guys show up in the channel, you interact with me in the channel, you post something to the Discord, we have a discussion, we have a conversation, etc. And in many ways, I'm interacting with some of you guys much more than I interact with some people who show up regularly to my church. I don't see how that's any different. Well, you can't possibly care for their soul the right way at a distance. Well, it depends on how much of their soul they're willing to bear over the internet. So I don't know that that's a complete impediment, okay? Finally, he asks at the end, what does the church look like, okay? What is a church? Remember, he said that. Well, there are a few things, if you think all the way back to Jeff Durbin, who we listened to at the beginning, there are a few things that he mentions in that video that he thinks are important to happen in person. He says oversight is important. Well, I already addressed that just now. He says fellowship is important. I started to address that as well. Worship is important, okay? Serving is important. Connection is important. Of course, the preaching of the word is important. And finally, the sacraments are important, okay? So you can see there are important aspects to all of this stuff. Here's the problem. All of these things can be done in an online way. Now, some to greater degrees than others, right? Some with more effectiveness than others. And that's where the rub is at. Because, okay, can somebody show spiritual oversight over somebody else from a distance? Well, yes and no, right? Can somebody fellowship with somebody over a distance? Yes and no. Can you worship with somebody over a distance? That seems a little harder to me. That seems like you need to be more in person, okay? Can you serve from a distance? Well, yes and no, right? Perhaps there's an element of the online ministry that you can plug into and help serve in. Okay, maybe you're serving. I don't know. Connection to others. That depends. Are you spending many hours on Zoom calls with people, conversing with them, discussing? I don't know. Preaching. That seems to me to be one of the ones that translates best to an online medium. You can sit and listen, take your notes, etc. Now, you can't chat with the pastor afterwards, but still, that's pretty close, right? The sacraments, okay? And we've talked about this in the past, right? I baptize people in person. I administer the Lord's table in person. But more and more churches have done online communions. Hey, go into your kitchen, get your bread, get your wine, and then come back out and we're all going to participate. We're at a distance, but you can participate. Can you administer communion to yourself? That feels bad, but it feels bad for me in the exact same way that I just traditionally point out, go to the local church, go to the local church, go to the local church. Guys, feels bad is not an argument, okay? Feels bad is not, well, yeah, that's unbiblical, that doesn't work. Again, how many of the injunctions biblically are there because it's true of necessity, or are there because it's true that they couldn't conceive of it any differently, okay? Those are the sorts of questions we need to wrestle through, all right? Can you baptize somebody at a distance? That seems wrong to me. It feels bad to me. It feels like it doesn't make sense, but these are the sorts of things we're going to have to wrestle with. Don't get me wrong. I don't think you can outsource the church entirely. I don't think you can say of the entire church, we can just do the entire thing with no in-person interaction or situation. I like what was discussed before about the both and situation, right? The both and could be very, very helpful. But how much of this is both? How much of it is and? How much of it are we going to put online? How much of it are we going to say, no, you have to be in person for that piece? Okay? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. These are the discussions we need to have, because really this is where the heart of the conversation is at. Okay? This is where the heart of the conversation is at. Okay, guys, so that does it for my discussion of how should the church adapt to the internet age. I'm not pretending that offered all of the answers. In fact, I might have raised more questions than things I answered. But hopefully it gets you started at least on how to think through some of these ideas, and hopefully it was helpful to that end. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way to the end. It really helps out the channel. I hope it provided value to you. Other ways you can support our channel is to click that subscribe button and click the notification button. If you want to support us financially, you can do so at a link to our Patreon down in the description below. Every dollar goes towards helping grow this ministry and is greatly appreciated. Thank you so much for supporting us in any way that you can. Take care. God bless. Bye now.